Look at her, barely able to walk straight. What's a broken-down civilian like that doing serving the best warriors on the planet? This place should have some standards. The voice, belonging to a young petty officer whose brand-new trident was practically glowing on his chest, cut through the low din of the seaside diner. The crowd, a mix of local civilians and other, equally young Navy SEALs fresh from training, chuckled nervously. A few of the older salts in the corner, men whose tridents were faded and worn, simply stirred their coffee and kept their eyes down, a silent, implicit disapproval of the rookie's arrogance. But the object of the insult, a waitress named Anna, didn't react. She didn't flinch. Her face, a study in placid neutrality, gave no indication she had even heard him. Her focus was absolute, centered on the methodical, circular motion of a damp cloth polishing the already gleaming surface of the chrome coffee urn. There was a slight limp in her stance, a subtle hitch in her gait as she moved from one end of the counter to the other, a physical imperfection that the young SEAL, Rourke, had so cruelly highlighted. He saw weakness. He saw a flaw. But when a retired admiral, sitting quietly in a corner booth, saw her plant her feet to lift a heavy bus tub, he didn't see a limp. He saw a combat stance, a center of gravity, so perfectly balanced it was unnatural for a civilian. He saw a ghost from a past he thought was buried in the mountains of Afghanistan. The admiral leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, a forgotten file cabinet in his mind creaking open. A name, a call sign, a story of impossible bravery flickered in the dark recesses of his memory. He watched her, this unassuming waitress, and a cold certainty began to settle in his gut. The boy had made a mistake, a terrible, career-defining mistake. If you believe that true strength is found not in the volume of your voice, but in the weight of your actions, type competence below. This waitress, this quiet, wounded woman, was about to teach a master class, and the tuition would be every ounce of one young warrior's pride. Her silence was not submission. It was the calm before a storm that had leveled empires, and it was about to break over this small, unsuspecting diner with the force of a tidal wave. She was a living lesson in the most sacred rule of the warrior class. The most dangerous person in the room is the one who doesn't need to prove it. The young SEAL, Petty Officer Rourke, wasn't finished. Emboldened by the sycophantic laughter of his peers and the woman's complete lack of response, he pressed his attack. Seriously, we come back from hell and back. We push our bodies to the absolute limit for this country. And this is the welcome we get? Served by someone who looks like she lost a fight with a lawnmower? Maybe we should get our coffee from someone who can actually carry the pot, without looking like they're about to fall over. His voice was laced with a particular kind of venom, the kind born from insecurity that masquerades as superiority. He was projecting his own desperate need for validation onto her, using her apparent fragility as a whetstone to sharpen his own ego. The other diners shifted uncomfortably. The initial, nervous laughter had died, replaced by a thick, awkward silence. It was the kind of public cruelty that makes everyone a hostage. You want to speak up to defend the target, but the fear of becoming the next target is a powerful paralytic. Anna, however, remained an island of calm in a sea of social anxiety. She picked up a heavy porcelain coffee pot, her grip firm, her knuckles showing white not from strain, but from a controlled, practiced pressure. Her movements were a study in efficiency. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. The limp was there, a constant reminder of some past trauma, but it was integrated into her movements, compensated for with a precision that was almost hypnotic. She moved toward Rourke's table, the hot coffee sloshing gently inside the pot. Her eyes were not on him, but on the empty cup in front of his commanding officer, a seasoned senior chief named Miller who sat beside him, his face a mask of weary disappointment. As she approached, Miller's old military working dog, a Belgian Malinois named Thor with graying fur around his muzzle and a clouded, knowing gaze, lifted his head. The dog, a veteran of a dozen deployments, whined softly, not a sound of aggression, but of recognition. A low, questioning rumble deep in his chest. Rourke scoffed. Even the dog feels sorry for her. But Senior Chief Miller wasn't looking at Anna's limp. He was looking at her hands. They were steady, impossibly steady. He had seen hands like that before, in briefing rooms before a mission, on the trigger of a rifle in a sandstorm, in the blood-soaked back of a helicopter applying a tourniquet with a calm that defied the chaos. They were the hands of a professional, and they were attached to a woman serving him coffee. The contradiction was so stark, so jarring, that it sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through him. He knew, with the chilling certainty of a man who had survived by reading the subtle signs of danger, that nothing in this room was what it seemed. The silence from the waitress was no longer passive. It was predatory. It was the silence of a sniper settling into their hide, of a breacher at the door, of a professional waiting for the perfect moment to act. The air itself seemed to crackle with a tension that only a few of the men in that room were trained enough to feel. The mundane afternoon was about to shatter. The moment arrived not with a shout, but with the sudden, violent crash of the diner's front door being kicked open. Two men, faces obscured by cheap ski masks, burst inside. The first brandished a sawed-off shotgun, its wide, dark maw sweeping across the terrified patrons. The second held a pistol, waving it wildly, his voice a high-pitched, panicked shriek. Nobody move. Wallets and phones on the table. Now, fear, acrid and cold, flooded the room. A woman screamed. A chair scraped as someone tried to back away. The cheerful, sunlit diner transformed into a pressure cooker of primal terror. The young SEALs, including Rourke, tensed. Their training screamed at them to act, to engage, to neutralize the threat. But they were unarmed, caught flat-footed in a civilian setting. Their bodies were weapons, yes, but the distance, the presence of innocent bystanders, the shotgun, it was an equation with too many fatal variables. They were frozen, caught between instinct and tactical reality. But Anna was not frozen. In the split second that everyone else was processing the shock, she had already moved. She didn't drop the coffee pot. She used it. With a fluid, economical motion that seemed to defy the very existence of her limp, she pivoted on her good leg and swung the heavy porcelain pot in a short, brutal arc, connecting with the pistol-wielding robber's wrist. The crack of bone was sickeningly loud in the sudden silence, followed by the clatter of the pistol on the tile floor. She didn't stop. Her movement flowed like water into the next. As the first man crumpled, clutching his shattered wrist, she was already closing the distance on the second, the one with the shotgun. It was here that something truly impossible happened. Thor, Senior Chief Miller's war dog, who had been growling, hackles raised, ready to launch himself at the threat, suddenly stopped. He let out a sharp, confused yip. His attack posture melted away. As Anna moved past him, a blur of controlled violence, he didn't see a threat to his master. He saw something else. He saw a familiar pattern of movement, a specific gait, a scent he hadn't encountered in years but was burned into his very DNA. He saw a handler. He saw his handler. The man with the shotgun, stunned by the speed of the assault on his partner, tried to bring the weapon to bear on the approaching waitress. It was a fatal hesitation. Anna's left hand shot out, not to grab the barrel, but to cup the stock from underneath, her thumb finding and depressing the slide release with practiced, surgical precision. In the same motion, her right hand slammed the pump action forward, ejecting the live shell from the chamber and jamming the weapon. It was a disarm technique taught in only one place on Earth, to a handful of operators who specialized in the world's most dangerous close-quarters environments. It was flawless. It was instantaneous. It was impossible for a civilian waitress. The room held its breath, suspended in a state of collective disbelief. The entire sequence, from the coffee pot swing to the shotgun jam, had taken less than 3 seconds. 3 seconds of sublime, terrifying competence. The shotgun-wielding robber stood there, holding a useless weapon, his eyes wide with shock behind the holes in his ski mask. He stared at the woman before him, this quiet waitress with a limp, who now stood in a perfect blade stance, her eyes cold and hard as glacial ice. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a physical entity, a deafening roar of astonishment that filled every corner of the diner. Rourke, the arrogant young SEAL, was on his feet, his jaw hanging open, his face a mask of utter, uncomprehending shock. He had been ready to die a hero, and a waitress with a limp had ended the fight before it even began. He whispered the only words his brain could form, a mantra of pure disbelief. No way. That's not possible, Senior Chief Miller, however, was already moving. He wasn't looking at the subdued robbers on the floor. He was looking at the dog. Thor, his loyal partner, his brother in arms through firefights and ambushes, was now whining, his tail wagging furiously. He padded over to the waitress, ignoring everyone and everything else, and nudged his head insistently into her steady hand. He licked her fingers, the same fingers that had just disarmed a man, with a gentle, adoring reverence. The dog knew. In the aftermath, the dog was the key, the Rosetta Stone that would unlock the entire mystery. While the other SEALs, now galvanized into action, secured the two would-be robbers and the local police were being called, Senior Chief Miller walked slowly, deliberately, toward Anna. He moved with the quiet authority of a man who had seen ghosts before. He didn't address her directly at first. His gaze was fixed on the Belgian Malinois, now leaning contentedly against her leg. "Thor," Miller said, his voice low and gravelly. "Who is that, boy? Who did you find?" The dog just whined again, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy, and looked up at the woman, then back at Miller, as if to say, "You see? She's here. I found her." Miller's eyes lifted from the dog to the woman's hands, then to her face. The placid, neutral mask of the waitress was gone. In its place was something else, something he recognized from the faded photographs of fallen heroes on the memorial walls at Dam Neck and Coronado. It was the look of a Tier 1 operator in the moments after contact, calm, alert, assessing, already processing the aftermath and planning the next 3 moves. The limp, the quiet demeanor, the unassuming uniform. It was all camouflage. The best camouflage he had ever seen. He took a final step forward, standing directly in front of her, close enough to see the fine network of scars around her left eye, almost invisible in the diner's gentle light. He ignored the chaos around them, the wail of approaching sirens, the stunned babbling of the patrons. For him, there were only 3 beings in the room. Him, the woman, and the dog that connected them across a gulf of years and pain. He lowered his voice, asking a question that was not a question, but a key to a door that was supposed to remain locked forever. The breach on Objective Viper's Nest. Zabul Province, 2012. "You were the handler for Ares, weren't you?" It was a reference so specific, so deep within the classified annals of special operations, that no more than a dozen living people would understand its significance. It was the name of a mission, a place, and a fallen hero, a war dog, Thor's littermate, who had died saving their team. Anna's eyes met his. The briefest flicker of shared memory, of shared loss, passed between them. Her response was not a story or an explanation. It was a single, clipped professional acknowledgement, the kind a soldier gives to a superior officer. "Ares was my partner, Senior Chief." The words hung in the air, imbued with a weight that buckled the knees of the young SEALs standing nearby who had overheard. The truth, in all its shocking, humbling glory, began to dawn. Miller's face, a roadmap of hard-won battles and lost friends, seemed to crumble and then reform. The weary disappointment he had felt toward his young charge, Rourke, was replaced by a profound, soul-shaking wave of awe and respect. He turned his head slowly, deliberately, to face the circle of stunned operators and civilians. His voice was not loud, but it commanded the absolute attention of every person in the room. It was the voice of a man about to correct the historical record. "This," he began, his gaze locking onto Rourke with the force of physical blow, "is not a broken-down civilian. This is not a waitress." He took a deep breath, as if the words themselves were heavy. "You are looking at Command Sergeant Major Elena Vance, United States Army. Call sign, Wraith, formerly assigned to a unit you are not cleared to know about." He gestured with his chin toward her leg. "That limp? That's what's left of a suicide bomber's VBAED in Kandahar. An attack that happened 10 feet from me and my dog." He pointed at Thor, who was still pressed against her. "She threw herself between us and the blast. She shielded us. Her dog, Ares, died that day. Thor and I lived. 5 other members of my team lived. Because of her." He paused, letting the weight of the revelation settle like a shroud over the room. "Her official record reads like a goddamn legend. Navy Cross, Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, 6 Purple Hearts, Lead K-9 handler and master breacher for the most elite direct action unit this country has ever produced. She has more confirmed kills than most platoons and has saved more American lives than any politician who will ever shake your hand. Miller's eyes were burning now, filled with a righteous fire. He turned back to face Elena Vance, the command sergeant major who was quietly wiping a coffee stain from the counter. He saw the hero, not the waitress. Without a moment's hesitation, Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Miller, a legend in the SEAL teams, a man who bowed to no one, snapped his body to the rigid, formal posture of attention. His hand came up in a salute so sharp, so precise, it seemed to cut the air. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion and a respect so deep it was almost holy. "It is an honor to see you again. Permission to thank you for my life." The story of what happened to the Seaside Diner spread through the Naval Special Warfare community like a flash fire. It wasn't just gossip. It was a parable, a real-time lesson in the core tenets of their creed. It traveled in hushed whispers in the barracks, in shouted retellings in the team rooms, and in stern, object lessons delivered by grizzled master chiefs to wide-eyed recruits. The name Elena Vance, once a classified ghost, became a touchstone for humility. The call sign Wraith was now synonymous with a competence so profound it required no announcement. For Petty Officer Rourke, the aftermath was a crucible. He wasn't just reprimanded, he was deconstructed. Senior Chief Miller, along with every other senior enlisted leader on the base, used him as a living teaching aid. He was made to stand before his platoon and recount his words, his arrogance, his catastrophic failure of judgment. They didn't mock him. They did something far worse. They educated him. They stripped him of his unearned pride and forced him to confront the chasm between his perception of a warrior and the reality embodied by the quiet waitress he had belittled. The true test of his character came a week later. On Miller's orders, Rourke drove to the diner. He wasn't in uniform. He wore civilian clothes, a deliberate stripping of his rank and status. He walked in during the quiet mid-afternoon lull and saw her, Elena, wiping down tables, her limp a steady, rhythmic counterpoint to her movements. He walked up to her, his own hand shaking, and stood before her. "Ma'am," he started, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat and began again, looking her directly in the eye. "My name is Petty Officer Rourke. Last week, I was arrogant, disrespectful, and ignorant. What I said was inexcusable. There is no apology that can cover the disrespect I showed you, but I am offering it anyway. I am sorry. You are everything I hoped to be, and I failed to see it. I failed the test." He stood there, braced for a tirade, a dismissal, anything. Elena finished wiping the table and straightened up, her expression unreadable. She simply looked at him for a long moment, her gaze analytical, not judgmental. Then she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Assumptions are a luxury we can't afford in our line of work, Petty Officer," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Remember that it was not forgiveness. It was a lesson, and it was more than he deserved." He simply nodded, mumbled, "Yes, ma'am," and left the diner a different man than the one who had entered. A small, framed photograph soon appeared on the wall behind the counter, next to the health inspection certificate. It was a picture taken by Senior Chief Miller a few days after the incident. It showed Elena, in her simple waitress uniform, standing behind the counter. To her left stood Miller, a proud grin on his face. And sitting faithfully at her feet, looking up at her with absolute adoration, was Thor. There was no caption, no explanation. There didn't need to be. For those who knew the story, the picture was a shrine. It was a silent, powerful monument to the truth that the measure of a warrior is not the uniform they wear or the insignia on their chest, but the quiet dignity and lethal competence they carry within their soul. Months later, the Seaside Diner was different. It was still a diner, still served coffee and eggs, but its atmosphere had fundamentally changed. It had become a kind of unofficial landmark for the nearby naval base. The young SEALs, the ones fresh out of the brutal crucible of BUD/S, would come in, not with the boisterous, chest-thumping arrogance of Rourke's class, but with a quiet, almost reverent demeanor. They would take a booth, order their food, and their eyes would inevitably drift to the photograph behind the counter. They would watch Elena Vance as she worked, her movements still efficient, her limp still present, her silence still absolute. They saw her not as a waitress, but as a standard. She was a living embodiment of the quiet professional they were all taught to be. They were there to eat, but they were also there to learn, to observe, to pay their respects. They had heard the story of the waitress and the war dog, a tale that was now told to every new class as a stark warning against the sin of pride. The story had become institutional folklore, a modern myth passed down from instructors to students. It served as a potent reminder that the world was filled with threats and heroes in equal measure, and that they were often impossible to tell apart by sight alone. It taught them that respect was not a commodity to be demanded, but a debt to be paid to those who had earned it, often in ways you could never comprehend. Elena, for her part, seemed unchanged by her newfound local fame. She treated the young, respectful seals the same way she treated the local fishermen and the tourists. She served them coffee, took their orders, and moved with the same quiet purpose that had defined her from the beginning. She had found a measure of peace in this simple, rhythmic life, a world away from the high-stakes violence of her past. But sometimes, when Senior Chief Miller would bring Thor by for a visit, a different side of her would emerge. She would kneel down, her bad leg protesting, and bury her face in the dog's thick fur. And for a fleeting moment, the mask of the stoic waitress and the ghost of the Tier 1 operator would both fall away, revealing just a woman, a soldier, mourning a partner she had lost and finding solace in the one that was returned to her. The legacy she was building here was not one of classified missions or battlefield valor. It was a legacy of quiet influence, a testament to the idea that true strength doesn't need to announce itself. It simply is. The world is built on stories. Not the loud, bombastic tales shouted from the rooftops, but the quiet, foundational narratives that shape our character and define our values. The story of Elena Vance became one of those pillars for a generation of warriors. It was a story not of what she did in that diner, but of who she was every single day, disciplined, humble, and competent to her very core. Her life became a lesson plan. The diner became a classroom. Her silence became a sermon. Years from now, young men and women, their faces still etched with the exhaustion of Hell Week, will walk into that diner and see a photograph on the wall. They will hear the whispers of a legend, a story about a waitress, a war dog, and a humbling that echoed through the halls of heroes. They will learn that a limp can be a mark of sacrifice, not weakness. They will learn that true respect is a currency earned in silence and paid in deference. And they will understand, perhaps for the first time, that the most profound legacy you can leave is not a record of the battles you have won, but the quiet standard of excellence you inspire in others. True legacy isn't about the medals you leave behind on a shelf. It's about the principles that continue to move forward in the hearts of those who follow. It is the echo of competence in a world filled with noise. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where silent discipline defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.